Star Trek saved one of its darkest sequels for the original series' kids-only planet. When most people think of Star Trek, the original series, they picture brightly lit bridges, optimistic speeches about unity, and Captain Kirk's swagger as he stares down impossible odds. But like many groundbreaking science fiction shows of its era, TOS also wasn't afraid to dive into some of the darkest corners of the human condition. From episodes about authoritarian governments to eerily prescient tales about technology's dangers, Gene Roddenberry's wagon train to the stars wasn't always sunshine and diplomacy. And one of the darkest what-ifs the franchise ever considered was actually hidden in plain sight, lurking in an episode often dismissed as one of the sillier, less beloved outings. The kids-only planet of Miri Season 1, Episode 8 was once poised to get a full-blown sequel. What could have been a minor footnote in Trek history nearly became one of the franchise's most chilling continuations, exploring childlike innocence turned monstrous, plague-born societies, and the failure of adults to safeguard their future. It's one of those stories where you can't help but ask, if Star Trek had dared to follow through, would we be looking back at Miri not as a strange one-off curiosity, but as the foundation for one of the darkest sagas the franchise ever attempted? The original Miri, a childhood nightmare in space. The premise of Miri sounds almost whimsical on the surface. The USS Enterprise stumbles onto a planet that looks suspiciously like Earth for budgetary reasons. It literally was Earth's outdoor sets. But the real horror comes in the details. The planet's adult population was wiped out by a plague. Only children remain, the onlies, as they call themselves. These kids are doomed by a terrifying biological twist. The disease only manifests once puberty begins, meaning every only is essentially living on borrowed time. They enjoy centuries-long childhoods, free from aging, but the second adulthood beckons, their bodies twist and rot into monstrous, violent husks before they die. Captain Kirk, Spock, and McCoy's attempts to cure the disease are a race against time, not only because the Enterprise crew is infected as well, but because the children themselves are dangerously unstable. They distrust adults, grups, in their slang, and turn feral at the thought of being abandoned again. The Enterprise eventually synthesizes a cure, leaving the kids with a chance at survival and a vague promise that the Federation will help them rebuild. But in classic TOS fashion, the episode ends abruptly. The crew warps away, and the story leaves us with more questions than answers. What happens when those children grow up? What happens to a society where everyone has been a child for centuries, with no adults to guide them? Could the Federation really fix a culture that had evolved in such twisted circumstances? Those dangling threads begged for more exploration, and at one point, Star Trek considered giving Miri the bleak follow-up it deserved, the lost sequel that never happened. Decades after TOS ended, writer-producers toyed with the idea of revisiting the onlies. Notes and pitches for potential TOS continuations, as well as ideas floated during Star Trek, Phase 2 and later by fandom-driven continuations, often circled back to Miri. One of the darker pitches went something like this. The Federation returns to Miri's planet, expecting to see progress after the cure. Instead, they find a world plunged into chaos. The onlies, freed from their suspended childhoods, grew up, but without stable cultural anchors or parental models, their society fractured. Some clung to twisted versions of childhood games as government. Others became violent and authoritarian. The Federation's good intentions had failed, and Miri's world became a bleak mirror of what happens when children inherit trauma with no guidance. Imagine the Federation facing that discovery, the realization that their noble optimism isn't enough, that dropping off medicine and leaving doesn't undo centuries of broken development. It would have forced Kirk and crew into a confrontation with their own assumptions about exploration and responsibility. And in a particularly chilling idea, some pitches suggested that the Grupp disease wasn't truly gone. Instead, it mutated, leaving behind survivors who lived, but not without horrifying physical or psychological scars. This wasn't just a sequel to Miri. It would have been Star Trek openly admitting that happy endings are not guaranteed, and that sometimes the Enterprise's quick-fix solutions could plant seeds of long-term tragedy. Why Miri still haunts the franchise. The reason a potential sequel remains so compelling is because Miri itself is such an unsettling story when you strip away the 1960s production quirks. At its heart, it's a horror tale disguised as science fiction. The images are unforgettable: children, faces twisted with plague, lurking in shadows while chanting nursery rhymes. The innocence of childhood collides with grotesque disease, creating one of Trek's earliest examples of body horror. It also challenged one of Star Trek's most sacred ideals, the notion that progress and hope are inevitable. In Miri, hope is fragile and conditional. Without intervention, every child will die. And even with intervention, survival doesn't guarantee a functioning society. A sequel would have forced the franchise to lean into this discomfort. Could the Federation handle the moral responsibility of raising an entire civilization? Would they impose adult structures on the Onlais, essentially forcing them to abandon their childlike identity? Or would they let the culture evolve naturally, even if it meant the Onlais world grew into something alien and dangerous? Those are not easy questions, and they strike at the core of what Star Trek was always meant to explore: the messy, gray area of morality. The Onlais, across other Star Trek eras, while a direct sequel never materialized on screen, echoes of Miri linger across Star Trek. Several later series revisited the idea of kids without adults or youth societies gone wrong. Star Trek: The Next Generation gave us When the Bow Breaks, an episode about kidnapped children raised by sterile adults, another reflection on what happens when societies break their natural cycle. Star Trek: Voyager's Innocence flipped the concept, showing aliens who age backward and experience childhood at the end of their lives. Even Star Trek: Prodigy, in its youthful cast and themes, sometimes feels like a gentler version of the Onlais' dilemma: what happens when children are forced to take on adult responsibility too soon? But none of these episodes fully captured the raw horror of Miri. That unique blend of body horror, cultural collapse, and childlike innocence perverted by trauma remains distinct and perhaps too dark for mainstream Trek to ever touch again. Why the sequel was probably too dark for TOS? It's not hard to see why the Onlais sequel never made it to screen in the 1960s. Star Trek, the original series, was already struggling with censors who objected to violence, sexuality, and overtly bleak subject matter. The idea of revisiting a planet of children and showing them corrupted, diseased, or incapable of surviving into adulthood may simply have been too disturbing for primetime television. Even later incarnations of Trek may have balked. The 1980s and 1990s were eras of heightened optimism for the franchise. The Next Generation leaned heavily into utopian ideals, avoiding the kind of moral despair that Miri inherently represented. A story about the Federation's failure to save children might have clashed with Roddenberry's insistence on an idealized Starfleet. In some ways, the darker Onlais sequel might